Is there a cosmic force that balances the scales of justice? Across countless cultures and centuries, humans have told stories of divine retribution, a kind of ultimate karma where actions, especially pride or wickedness, seem to invite a supernatural response. We are about to journey through 30 of the most unbelievable examples from history, tales so strange they will genuinely make you question how the world works. You will discover why mighty empires crumbled overnight and how personal hubris led to public downfall. Why did a perfectly seaworthy ship sail without a crew? What ancient curse is linked to the deaths of multiple American presidents? By the end, you will see history through a lens of cosmic justice. What story of unexpected justice has always stuck with you? The grandeur of ancient Egypt has long whispered of hidden powers and vengeful gods. No story captures this fear more than the infamous curse of the pharaohs, a legend born from the dust of a single spectacular discovery. In 1922, the archaeologist Howard Carter, funded by the wealthy Lord Carnarvon, broke the seal on the tomb of the boy King Tutankhamun. The world was captivated by the treasures within, but that fascination soon turned to dread. Mere weeks after the tomb was opened, Lord Carnarvon died in Cairo from a seemingly minor mosquito bite that became fatally infected. The timing was uncanny, and the press quickly declared it the work of a 3,000-year-old curse. The legend grew with the sudden passing of others connected to the excavation. A close friend of Carnarvon died just after visiting the tomb. A financier collapsed on the spot during a tour, and Carter's own personal secretary passed from a mysterious illness. Each death was reported with sensational headlines, weaving a narrative of supernatural revenge for disturbing a sacred royal rest. Yet, could there be a rational explanation hidden within the tomb's sealed chambers? Scientists have since proposed that the curse may have had a very earthly source. The tomb was sealed for millennia, creating a perfect environment for dangerous bacteria and toxic mold to flourish on the walls and artifacts. Inhaling these ancient spores could have caused severe respiratory illnesses, potentially fatal to individuals with weakened immune systems. This biological theory offers a compelling counter to the supernatural, yet it fails to explain every death or the sheer coincidence of so much misfortune befalling the project's inner circle. The true power of the curse was not in a mystical incantation, but in the overwhelming public perception of divine punishment. It was a story that resonated because it suggested a universal law, a warning that even the most powerful modern explorers were not immune to the consequences of violating a sacred space. The legend endures because it forces us to ask whether some lines should never be crossed. That same theme of human pride meeting a sudden, catastrophic end echoes powerfully from the deserts of Egypt to the icy waters of the North Atlantic. The sinking of the RMS Titanic remains one of history's most profound maritime disasters, a tragedy magnified by the vessel's own legendary status. The White Star Line famously promoted the Titanic as practically unsinkable, a claim repeated so often it became accepted fact. This was more than just advertising. It was a declaration of human mastery over the natural world, a belief that modern engineering had finally conquered the ancient dangers of the sea. The ship was a floating palace of luxury, embodying the boundless confidence of an era. Yet on its maiden voyage in April 1912, this symbol of invincibility struck an iceberg and plunged into the dark ocean, taking over 1,500 lives with it. In the wake of such an unimaginable catastrophe, people searched desperately for meaning. How could such a technological marvel be defeated by a piece of floating ice? For many, the answer was not a simple navigational error, but a form of divine retribution for the sin of hubris. The universe itself, it seemed, had delivered a chilling lesson in humility. A strange subplot to this narrative emerged from the echoes of the Pharaoh's curse. A popular rumor began to circulate that the Titanic was carrying a cursed artifact, a mummy's coffin lid said to belong to a powerful Egyptian priestess. The story claimed this object held a malevolent force that doomed the ship, while historians have thoroughly debunked this, confirming no such artifact was on the manifest. The rumor itself is telling. It connected two powerful stories of arrogance and supernatural consequence, weaving a tapestry of cosmic justice that spanned continents and centuries. The true curse was not a mummy's wrath, but the crew's unwavering faith in their unsinkable ship, a belief so strong it may have encouraged the fatal decision to steam at high speed through a known ice field. The tragedy was interpreted by preachers and philosophers as a stark reminder that no human creation, no matter how grand, is immune to the forces of nature or fate. It served as a permanent check on human arrogance, a story forever reminding us that proclaiming something unsinkable might be the very act that invites the waves to test that claim. From the cold depths of the ocean, we journey to a far older and hotter story of judgment, one etched into the very bedrock of faith and legend. The tale of Sodom and Gomorrah stands as perhaps the ultimate archetype of divine retribution against an entire civilization. According to the book of Genesis, these two cities had become synonymous with profound wickedness and moral decay, their collective sin so grievous it reached a divine tipping point. The narrative describes how two angels were sent to the city, received with hospitality only by a man named Lot. The rest of the city's men, however, surrounded Lot's house, demanding he hand over his guests for their violent intentions. This act of aggression and inhospitality sealed the city's fate. A warning was given, a chance for escape offered only to Lot and his family. They were told to flee to the mountains and, crucially, not to look back. As they escaped, the sky erupted. The Lord rained down burning sulfur or brimstone upon Sodom and Gomorrah, utterly consuming the cities and all their inhabitants in a cataclysm of fire. Lot's wife, unable to resist, glanced back at the destruction and was instantly transformed into a pillar of salt, a permanent monument to the danger of disobedience and longing for a condemned life. This story has resonated for millennia because it transcends a simple punishment. It represents a complete and final judgment on a society perceived to have broken a fundamental moral covenant. The destruction was not just about random acts of evil, but about a culture that had normalized and celebrated its own corruption. For centuries, preachers and scholars have pointed to this account as a warning that civilizations can reach a point of no return, where collective sin invites collective ruin. The image of fiery rain from heaven has become a universal symbol of sudden, inescapable divine justice, a stark reminder that no society, no matter how advanced or wealthy, is immune to the consequences of its own moral choices. Centuries after Sodom's fire, another civilization faced a plague it believed was heaven-sent. In the 6th century, the Byzantine Empire was the glittering successor to Rome, a bastion of power and faith under the ambitious Emperor Justinian. His dream was to reclaim the lost glory of the Roman Empire, and his reign was marked by massive construction projects, including the magnificent Hagia Sophia and relentless military campaigns. Yet at the very peak of his power, a catastrophe unfolded that would be interpreted not as bad luck, but as a clear sign of God's displeasure. The bubonic plague arrived in the empire in the year 541, carried by fleas on black rats from trade ships. It moved with terrifying speed. People would appear perfectly healthy in the morning, develop a sudden fever by noon, and suffer agonizingly swollen lymph nodes or buboes before death often came by nightfall. The death toll was staggering, with some estimates suggesting the empire lost a quarter of its population, collapsing from over 26 million to around 19 million in just a few years. This was not merely a disease, it was an apocalypse. In the eyes of the people and the chroniclers of the time, this suffering had a direct cause. The plague was divine retribution for the sins of the emperor himself. Justinian was seen by his critics as arrogant and tyrannical, his wars as needlessly bloody, and his heavy taxation as oppressive. The sheer scale of the death and societal collapse seemed a punishment perfectly fitted to the crime of his pride. The empire's agricultural output and military strength were decimated, shattering Justinian's grand ambitions forever. The world watched a superpower brought to its knees, and the lesson was clear to all. When a leader's hubris grows too great, it can invite a scourge that consumes not just the ruler, but every single person under his rule. The plague of Justinian stands as one of history's earliest and most chilling examples of a pandemic being framed as divine judgment, a collective punishment that reshaped the world and left an enduring question in its wake. How thin is the line between human ambition and the forces that can erase it? The idea that a civilization's own moral decay could unravel its power finds its most enduring example in the fall of Rome. For centuries, the Roman Empire seemed unshakable, its legions, laws, and roads stretching across the known world. Yet by the 5th century, this colossal structure was crumbling, its western provinces overrun by invading tribes. For many who lived through that collapse, and for the early Christian historians who recorded it, this was not a simple political or military failure. It was a profound spiritual judgment, a divine retribution enacted on a grand historical scale. They pointed to the empire's internal rot as the true cause of its fall, a decadence so pervasive it invited catastrophe. The lavish excesses of the elite, the brutal gladiatorial games that desensitized the populace to suffering, and the widespread corruption that infected every level of government were seen not just as social problems, but as sins that had collectively offended God. This perspective was powerfully shaped by the empire's earlier persecution of Christians. For hundreds of years, believers had been martyred for their faith, thrown to lions and burned as human torches to entertain Roman crowds. When Emperor Constantine later converted to Christianity and it became the state religion, the narrative flipped entirely. The old pagan Rome, the one that had spilled the blood of the faithful, was now interpreted as a doomed entity. Its eventual collapse was seen as a delayed but inevitable punishment for those centuries of cruelty. The invading Goths and Vandals were not merely conquerors, they were unwitting instruments of a higher justice, sent to scourge a society that had lost its moral way. This interpretation offered a terrifying lesson about the fragility of power. It suggested that no amount of military might or architectural marvels could save an empire whose soul had withered from within. The very roads and aqueducts that symbolized Roman genius became monuments to a greatness that internal corruption had made unsustainable. How could such an advanced civilization simply vanish? For generations, the answer was clear. Its fall was a warning written in the ruins for all future empires to heed. The ruins of Rome taught a lesson about moral decay, but could a single day of terror shatter an entire era's faith in a benevolent God? On the morning of November 1st, 1755, the great city of Lisbon was preparing for Mass. It was All Saints' Day, and the churches were crowded with the faithful. Without warning, the ground began to heave. A massive earthquake, estimated at nearly 9.0 in magnitude, shattered the city. Lasting between 3 and 6 minutes, it opened fissures 5 meters wide in the earth. Then came the fires, ignited by countless candles, and kitchen hearths toppled in the chaos, and a devastating tsunami that swept in from the Atlantic, crashing over the city's harbor and waterfront. The sequence of quake, fire, and water obliterated one of Europe's most powerful capitals, killing tens of thousands in a matter of hours. In the immediate aftermath, religious authorities had a clear and terrifying explanation. This was divine retribution. The disaster had struck on a holy day, destroying the city's most opulent churches and cathedrals while sparing its red light district. For many preachers, this was not a random tragedy. It was a targeted punishment for Lisbon's sinfulness and vanity. The message was one of fear, urging a terrified population to repent for their collective wickedness. But this interpretation sparked a firestorm of a different kind. The sheer scale of the suffering forced Enlightenment thinkers to confront the event's moral implications. How could a just and all-powerful God permit such indiscriminate horror, killing the pious in church alongside the wicked? The philosopher Voltaire was profoundly shaken. He channeled his outrage into his famous work, Candide, savagely satirizing the idea that this was the best of all possible worlds. For Voltaire, the earthquake was not evidence of divine justice, but of a cold, indifferent universe. It was a powerful argument against blind optimism, forcing European thought to grapple with the problem of evil in a new and urgent way. The Lisbon earthquake thus created a fundamental rift. On one side stood the view of a punitive, intervening God, and on the other, a growing philosophical doubt about the very nature of providence. The trembling ground did more than destroy a city. It cracked the foundation of 18th-century certainty, leaving humanity to wonder if some disasters are simply acts of nature, devoid of any moral lesson at all. That philosophical rift over the Lisbon earthquake questioned whether disasters had a moral purpose, but centuries earlier, a single mountain delivered an answer so brutal it felt like judgment. Mount Vesuvius had been dormant for so long that the people living on its fertile slopes saw it as just another part of the landscape. Then, in August of the year 79, the mountain exploded. It was not a simple river of lava, but a cataclysm of superheated gas, ash, and rock that surged down its sides at impossible speeds. The prosperous Roman resort cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum were directly in its path. For the residents, the first sign of trouble was a towering plume of smoke, followed by a rain of pumice stone that made the sky go black. There was no time for a coordinated escape. Within hours, both cities were buried under meters of volcanic debris, their bustling streets, homes, and taverns sealed in a tomb of ash. This was not just a destruction, it was a preservation. The ash hardened, freezing the cities in a single, terrifying moment. Centuries of excavations have revealed a snapshot of Roman life so intimate it feels haunting. There are loaves of bread still in ovens, jars of wine, and messages scrawled on public walls. But the most chilling discoveries are the plaster casts of the victims. When archaeologists found voids in the hardened ash, they realized these were the spaces left by decomposed bodies. By carefully filling these voids with plaster, they created perfect casts of the people in their final postures, capturing their last moments of agony and despair. We see a family huddled together, a man covering his mouth, a dog writhing in pain. These are not skeletons, they are ghostly impressions of human beings, making the tragedy feel immediate and deeply personal. In the aftermath, many contemporary observers saw this as divine punishment. The cities, especially Pompeii, were known for their vibrant, often hedonistic lifestyles. They were popular resorts for wealthy Romans, places associated with indulgence. For early Christian writers, the eruption was a clear act of God, a fiery retribution against a society mired in vice, much like Sodom and Gomorrah. The volcano became an instrument of moral cleansing, wiping away a corrupt culture in a single, dramatic stroke. Even today, that interpretation lingers. The power of the story lies in its terrifying completeness. The people were not given a warning to flee, they were not offered a chance for repentance. They were caught in the middle of their daily lives, a stark reminder that consequences can arrive with sudden, absolute finality. Was Vesuvius a random geological event, or did its fire fall upon a city that lived as if there were no tomorrow? The plaster casts offer no answer, only a silent, eternal scream against the mountain. A ghost ship adrift on the open sea presents a different kind of mystery, one not of fiery destruction but of eerie silence. The merchant brigantine Mary Celeste was found on December 4, 1872, by the crew of the Dei Gratia. The vessel was sailing itself, her sails partially set and slightly damaged, but she was perfectly seaworthy. The cargo of denatured alcohol was largely intact, and there was a 6-month supply of food and water in the stores. The lifeboat was gone, and the crew of 10, including the captain, his wife, and their 2-year-old daughter, had vanished without a trace. The last log entry was from 10 days prior, and it noted nothing alarming. Everything was in perfect order, yet the people were gone, as if they had simply evaporated into the salt air. The discovery ignited a global firestorm of speculation. How could an entire crew abandon a perfectly sound ship in the middle of the ocean? The lack of any clear explanation invited supernatural theories. Had the crew been punished for some terrible, unknown transgression? Was the ship cursed, a vessel marked for divine retribution that forced its occupants to flee into a watery grave? The very ordinariness of the scene made it all the more chilling. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence of piracy or mutiny, and no weather severe enough to justify such a desperate act. This void of evidence became a canvas for the imagination, painted with fears of sea monsters, alien abductions, and the wrath of a vengeful god. More rational theories have since emerged, of course. Perhaps a faulty alcohol vapor reading caused the captain to fear an imminent explosion, leading to a panicked but tragically mistaken evacuation. Maybe the ship encountered a waterspout or a sudden, violent squall that prompted them to take to the lifeboat, only to be lost when the tow line snapped. Yet none of these theories fully explain the complete absence of the crew or their failure to ever reboard their stable vessel. The enduring power of the Mary Celeste story lies in its perfect ambiguity. It is a riddle with no solution, a stark reminder that the ocean keeps its deepest secrets. The ship itself became a symbol of cosmic injustice, a case where no crime was evident, but a terrible price was paid nonetheless. It forces us to wonder what unseen force could compel a group of experienced mariners to choose the vast, unforgiving sea over the safety of their own ship. That same unforgiving nature that claimed the Mary Celeste could also transform a hopeful journey into a desperate struggle for survival on land. The story of the Donner Party began with the promise of a better life in California, a dream shared by many families in the spring of 1846. They were ordinary pioneers, farmers and shopkeepers, setting out from Illinois with their wagons full of belongings and their hearts full of ambition. The trouble started with a shortcut, a newly published guide promising a faster route called the Hastings Cutoff. It bypassed the established trail, but its descriptions were dangerously optimistic, failing to mention the brutal desert and the towering mountain ranges that lay ahead. The group's leader, George Donner, made the fateful decision to take this untested path, a choice that would cost them everything. The Hastings Cutoff was a disaster. It forced them to carve a road through the Wasatch Mountains, exhausting their animals and draining their precious supplies. By the time they reached the Sierra Nevada, they were already weeks behind schedule and physically spent. Then an early winter struck with a fury no one could have predicted. Relentless blizzards buried the mountain passes under 20 feet of snow, trapping the 81 emigrants in a frozen hell. Their food vanished quickly. They first boiled oxhide into a gluey soup, then roasted family pets. As starvation took hold, the unthinkable became necessary. To survive, the living were forced to consume the dead. The details are as horrific as they are heartbreaking, a stark testament to the extremes of human endurance when faced with certain death. When rescue parties finally broke through months later, they found a scene of unimaginable suffering. Only 45 members survived, many of them children who had witnessed the full horror. In the years that followed, preachers and moralists looked back on the tragedy and saw more than just bad luck. They framed it as a clear case of divine retribution. The decision to take the shortcut was painted not as a simple error in judgment, but as an act of greed and impatience, a sinful desire to get ahead that flew in the face of natural order. By choosing the easier, faster path, the Donner Party had invited a celestial punishment that matched their transgression. Their fate served as a grim warning to all of westward expansion, a reminder that the pursuit of fortune should never override caution and humility. The mountains did not just claim their lives, they became a monument to a profound moral lesson, asking us how far we are willing to go for a shortcut and what we might become when that choice goes terribly wrong. While pioneers faced the wilderness, a different kind of storm was brewing in the heart of America, one that would cast a long shadow over the highest office in the land. The legend of Tecumseh's curse began not in the White House but on a battlefield in 1811. The Shawnee leader Tecumseh and his brother, a spiritual leader known as the Prophet, were forging a powerful confederacy of Native American tribes to resist the relentless westward expansion of American settlers. While Tecumseh was away, his brother foolishly engaged the forces of General William Henry Harrison at the Battle of Tippecanoe. Harrison's victory was a devastating blow to the tribal alliance. Outraged by what he saw as a betrayal and the loss of his people's land, Tecumseh is said to have laid a curse upon Harrison and all future presidents. The specific prophecy warned that Harrison would not win a great victory to become the great chief, and that after him, every chief chosen every 20 years would die in office. Harrison, of course, did go on to win the presidency in 1840, a year divisible by 20. His inauguration day was bitterly cold and windy, yet he chose to give the longest inaugural address in American history without a coat or hat. He fell ill with pneumonia and died just 1 month later, becoming the first president to die in office. The curse appeared to be dormant for decades, but then the pattern re-emerged with terrifying precision. Abraham Lincoln, elected in 1860, was assassinated. James Garfield, elected in 1880, was assassinated. William McKinley, elected in 1900, was assassinated. Warren Harding, elected in 1920, died of a sudden illness. Franklin Roosevelt, elected in 1940, died of a cerebral hemorrhage, and John F. Kennedy, elected in 1960, was assassinated. For over a century, every single president elected in a 0-year term had died while serving, a streak of misfortune so consistent it seemed to defy mere chance. The nation watched this pattern unfold with a kind of macabre fascination, and the legend of the curse became a staple of American political folklore. It was interpreted as a form of divine retribution for the broken treaties and the suffering inflicted upon Native Americans, a supernatural debt being collected from the nation's leaders every 20 years. Then came the election of 1980 and Ronald Reagan. Surely the curse would claim another victim, but in March of 1981, President Reagan was shot by a would-be assassin. The bullet lodged an inch from his heart, a seemingly fatal wound. Yet, against all odds, he survived, making a full and remarkably quick recovery. His survival broke the curse's grim cycle. Some saw this as a matter of modern medicine and sheer luck, while others wondered if the nation had finally atoned for its past or if the curse's power had simply faded with time. The curse of Tippecanoe remains one of the most compelling and eerie examples of perceived political karma, a story where history and superstition collide, forcing us to ponder whether some patterns are just coincidence or a ghost from the past ensuring that history is never truly forgotten. A city of wood and ambition, Chicago was a tinderbox waiting for a single spark. In October 1871, after an unusually dry summer, that spark arrived. The Great Chicago Fire began on the evening of October 8th, most likely in a small barn behind the home of Patrick and Catherine O'Leary. Fanned by a fierce wind, the flames quickly jumped from the barn to nearby structures, and then the entire city seemed to ignite. For 2 full days, the inferno raged uncontrollably, consuming everything in its path. Wooden buildings, sidewalks, and even the streets themselves became fuel for the colossal blaze. The heat was so intense that stone and iron buildings melted into rubble. When the fire finally burned itself out, it had left a scar of devastation 4 miles long and almost a mile wide, reducing the heart of the city to ashes and leaving more than 100,000 people homeless. In the search for a simple cause, a powerful and enduring myth was born. A newspaper reporter, needing a sensational angle, fabricated the story that Catherine O'Leary's cow had kicked over a lantern while she was milking it. The image was perfect, a tale of simple carelessness with cosmic consequences. But for the preachers and moralists of the era, the cause was far more profound than a clumsy animal. They stood before their congregations amidst the smoldering ruins and declared the fire a deliberate act of God. This was divine retribution, they thundered, a purifying fire sent to punish Chicago for its sins. The city had grown too fast, becoming a symbol of reckless greed and moral decay. Its bustling stockyards, its flashy new wealth, and its notorious vice districts were all evidence of a community that had turned its back on righteousness. The fact that the fire had destroyed so many churches was seen not as a contradiction, but as proof that the entire city had been found wanting. This narrative of punishment provided a comforting, if terrifying, explanation for a random catastrophe. It meant there was a reason for the suffering, a lesson to be learned from the ashes. For decades, the story of Mrs. O'Leary and her cow persisted, a folk tale that neatly bundled human error with a sense of higher judgment. It was a warning to every booming American city, a reminder that material progress without moral integrity could invite a cleansing fire from heaven. The city would, of course, rebuild itself with astonishing speed, rising from the ashes with stronger steel and grander designs, but the memory of the fire and the stories told about it would forever be a part of its soul, a whisper that even the greatest achievements can be fragile when tested by flames. Just as Chicago's ashes cooled, another monument to human pride was preparing for its own swift descent. On a calm August day in 1628, the Swedish warship Vasa was the pride of the nation. King Gustavus Adolphus had commissioned it to be the most powerful warship in the Baltic, a floating fortress bristling with 64 bronze cannons spread over 2 gun decks. Its hull was ornately carved with lions and biblical figures, painted in vivid reds and golds, a symbol of royal power and national ambition. As it was towed from the Stockholm shipyard, a light breeze filled its sails. The ship glided into the harbor, a magnificent spectacle watched by the city's entire population. Then, after sailing less than a nautical mile, a stronger gust caught the sails. The Vasa heeled sharply to its port side, water rushed in through the open lower gun ports, and within minutes, the magnificent vessel sank to the bottom of the sea, taking dozens of lives with it. The disaster was immediate, total, and shockingly public. An official inquest was launched at once, but the cause was embarrassingly clear. The ship was dangerously unstable. The king, eager to project strength in his ongoing war, had demanded a ship with an unprecedented number of heavy guns on a relatively narrow and tall hull. The design was altered during construction to add a second gun deck, making the vessel top-heavy and prone to tipping. The shipwrights knew of the instability, but who could tell a king his ambition was a physical impossibility? In the aftermath, the search for blame was as frantic as the rescue attempts had been. The inquest could not pin the fault on any single individual, and the ship's master, who survived, was ultimately held responsible for not properly ballasting the ship. But in the public mind and the court's whispers, the true fault lay higher. This was seen as a classic case of divine retribution against the hubris of a monarch. King Gustavus Adolphus was a brilliant military leader, but his pride had overruled the laws of physics and the cautious advice of his shipbuilders. The Vasa was not merely a ship, it was a manifestation of his ego, and its swift, humiliating failure was interpreted as a divine correction. God had punished the king's arrogance by destroying his grandest symbol in full view of his subjects, a lesson in humility written not in fire, but in the cold, dark waters of the harbor. For over 3 centuries, the Vasa lay preserved in the Baltic mud, a forgotten monument to failure. Then, in 1961, it was raised in a near-perfect state of preservation. Today, it sits in its own museum in Stockholm, the only intact 17th-century warship in the world. It is no longer a symbol of shame, but a breathtaking time capsule and a permanent, tangible reminder that no amount of power or ambition can defy the fundamental laws of nature. As the Vasa settled into its watery grave, another wave of devastation was already sweeping across a continent, one that would challenge the very soul of medieval Europe. The Black Death arrived in 1347, a pestilence so swift and merciless it seemed to defy all earthly explanation. Carried by fleas on black rats from trading ships, the bacterium Yersinia pestis unleashed an apocalyptic nightmare. Victims developed fevers and chills, followed by the terrifying appearance of swollen lymph nodes called buboes in their groins and armpits. These would turn black and ooze pus and blood, a horrifying sign that death was imminent, often within days. The scale of the mortality was incomprehensible. In just a few years, the plague wiped out an estimated 30 to 50% of Europe's entire population. Whole villages were emptied, fields lay fallow, and the stench of death hung permanently in the air. This was not just a sickness, it was a biblical-scale cataclysm that shattered the medieval worldview. In the face of such indiscriminate suffering, the Church's explanations felt hollow. Why were the pious dying alongside the wicked? The only answer that made sense to a terrified populace was that this was divine retribution on an unimaginable scale. God was punishing a sinful humanity, and the entire world was guilty. From this climate of absolute despair and fear emerged one of the most extreme religious movements in history, the Flagellants. These were laypeople, not priests, who believed they could appease God's wrath through a gruesome form of public penance. They traveled from town to town in disciplined bands, sometimes numbering in the hundreds. Their rituals were a public spectacle of pain and piety. They would strip to the waist and beat themselves with whips embedded with metal spikes, lashing their own backs until they were bloody and torn. With each blow, they chanted hymns and begged for God's mercy, believing their self-inflicted suffering could atone for the collective sins of society and bring an end to the plague. For a time, they were seen as living saints, welcomed by towns desperate for any hope of salvation. People would gather to watch these bloody processions, many joining in the fervent prayers, convinced they were witnessing a powerful spiritual intervention. The Flagellants offered a tangible, if brutal, solution where the established church had failed. They created a new and terrifying form of sacred theater, where the lines between piety and madness blurred. Yet their movement soon spiraled into something darker. They began to claim their acts were more effective than the sacraments of the church, and some groups turned violently against local clergy and Jews, accusing them of causing the plague. The very institution that had initially tolerated them now saw them as a threat to its authority. Pope Clement VI finally condemned the movement, and the Flagellants were suppressed, their brief, bloody chapter closing as the plague itself eventually receded. Their desperate response stands as a haunting testament to the human capacity for endurance and the terrifying extremes we will embrace when faced with what feels like the wrath of God. What would you be willing to do? What pain would you endure if you believed it was the only way to save a dying world? The desperation of the Flagellants showed how terror could twist faith into violence, but in the glittering court of Imperial Russia, a very different kind of figure would inspire a hatred so profound it ended in a scene of almost mythical brutality. Grigory Rasputin was a Siberian peasant who presented himself as a holy man, a wandering mystic whose piercing eyes and raw charisma captivated the capital of St. Petersburg. His rise to power was as unlikely as it was meteoric, all stemming from a single, desperate need. The Tsar and Tsarina's only son, Alexei, suffered from hemophilia, a condition where the slightest bump could lead to fatal internal bleeding. When the best doctors in Europe failed, Rasputin was brought to the boy's bedside. Through some combination of hypnotic calm, prayer, or perhaps sheer force of will, he repeatedly seemed to alleviate the child's suffering. In the eyes of his terrified mother, Tsarina Alexandra, this unwashed peasant was a miracle worker sent by God, a direct answer to her prayers. That gratitude became the foundation of his immense influence. Rasputin was soon advising the Tsarina on matters of state, and his presence in the royal palace became a national scandal. He was the exact opposite of everything the Russian aristocracy stood for. He was uneducated, uncouth, and rumored to be a drunkard and a womanizer who held wild, debauched parties. To the nobles and politicians, he was a corrupting force, a sinister puppeteer manipulating the Tsar through his wife, leading the mighty Russian Empire toward ruin. The belief grew that this man was not just immoral but actively evil, a demon in the guise of a monk whose very presence was poisoning the throne. A group of aristocrats led by Prince Felix Yusupov decided it was their patriotic duty to remove this cancer. The assassination plot they devised was as elaborate as it was brutal. On a cold December night in 1916, Yusupov lured Rasputin to his palace, promising a meeting with his beautiful wife. They served him cakes and wine laced with enough cyanide to kill several men. To their utter horror, Rasputin showed no ill effects. He simply ate the cakes and drank the wine, asking for more. Panicking, Yusupov then produced a revolver and shot the holy man in the back. Rasputin collapsed, and the conspirators believed their grim work was done. But when Yusupov returned to check the body, Rasputin's eyes flew open. He rose with a roar, attacking the prince before stumbling out into the snowy courtyard. The other conspirators opened fire, shooting him multiple times. Still, he would not die. They finally clubbed him into submission, bound his body, and threw him through a hole in the ice of the frozen Neva River. The official autopsy later revealed the true cause of death was drowning, proving he was still alive when he hit the water. For a nation already reeling from war and political instability, the story of Rasputin's superhuman endurance was terrifying. It fed the narrative that he was not entirely human, a malevolent force that could not be killed by ordinary means. Yet his death was also seen by millions as a clear act of divine retribution. The man who had wielded such corrupt power, who had so brazenly twisted faith for personal gain, had finally been judged. His killers saw themselves not as murderers, but as instruments of a higher justice, cleansing Russia of a demonic influence. The timing, however, was tragically ironic. Rasputin was killed in December 1916. Just over 2 months later, in March 1917, the Russian Revolution began, forcing Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate. The entire Romanov family, the dynasty Rasputin was accused of corrupting, would be executed by Bolshevik forces little more than a year after his death. To many, the sequence was unmistakable. The removal of the corrupting influence did not save the empire. It merely preceded its final, bloody collapse, as if the retribution had only just begun. The brutal execution of the Romanovs seemed to close a dark chapter, but the 20th century was just beginning to produce its own cataclysms, many born not from royal intrigue, but from simple, terrifying accident. In the busy harbor of Halifax, Nova Scotia, on the morning of December 6, 1917, the munitions ship Mont Blanc was making its way toward the Bedford Basin. It was a floating bomb packed with thousands of tons of high explosives, including TNT and a highly volatile form of picric acid. Heading in the opposite direction was the Norwegian vessel Imo, a relief ship on its way to Europe. A series of miscommunications and navigational errors brought the two ships into a collision course in the narrowest part of the harbor. The Mont Blanc was struck, and a fire immediately broke out on its deck. The crew, knowing the inevitable outcome, abandoned ship and rowed frantically for the opposite shore, screaming warnings that went unheeded by those watching from the city. The spectacle of a burning ship drifting toward the pier drew crowds of onlookers to their windows. Then, at 9:05 in the morning, the Mont Blanc erupted. The Halifax explosion was the largest human-made blast in history until the invention of the atomic bomb. The force was so immense it created a tsunami that washed high up onto the shore and a shockwave that flattened everything for over 1.5 miles. A white-hot mushroom cloud rose over 20,000 feet into the sky. Nearly 2,000 people were killed instantly, and another 9,000 were injured, many blinded by the shower of glass from shattered windows. The entire north end of the city was simply obliterated. In the face of such incomprehensible destruction, the human search for meaning began immediately. For some preachers and terrified survivors, this was not an accident. It was divine retribution. They pointed to Halifax's role as a major port in the First World War, a hub for the very machinery of death that was tearing Europe apart. The city, in their view, had profited from the global conflict, and this explosion was a punishment from a god weary of war, a stark lesson in the wages of violence that had arrived on their own doorstep. Yet a very different interpretation of the divine emerged from the ashes. A blizzard hit the city the very next day, hampering rescue efforts, but the response from the outside world was swift and overwhelming. The city of Boston, in particular, organized a massive relief train that fought through the snow to deliver medical supplies, doctors, and emergency personnel. This act of profound generosity forged a bond of gratitude that lasts to this day. And then there was the story of a single tree. In the ravaged neighborhood, a young rescue worker found a small, surviving evergreen tree, a symbol of stubborn life amidst the absolute ruin. He brought it back to his church, and they decided to erect it as a shared Christmas tree for the community, a tiny beacon of hope. The following year, the city of Boston received a special gift from the people of Halifax, a large Christmas tree as a heartfelt thank you for their aid. That tradition was revived decades later and continues now, with Nova Scotia sending a massive tree to Boston every year. This single act transformed the narrative. For many, the explosion was not a story of punishment, but one of divine mercy revealed through human compassion. The true miracle was not the blast, but the response, the way a horrific event revealed the capacity for selfless love and solidarity. The story of the Halifax explosion thus holds two powerful truths in tension: the human instinct to see judgment in random tragedy, and the equally powerful need to find a glimmer of grace, a single standing tree in a landscape of utter devastation. Flames in the sky over New Jersey heralded a new kind of terror. On May 6, 1937, the German airship LZ-129 Hindenburg approached its mooring mast at the Lakehurst Naval Air Station after a transatlantic flight. The massive Zeppelin, the pride of Nazi Germany and the largest aircraft ever to fly, was moments from completing a routine journey. Then, without warning, a flicker of flame appeared near its tail. In an instant, the entire hydrogen-filled vessel was engulfed in a colossal fireball. It took only 34 seconds for the majestic airship to be consumed, collapsing into a smoldering skeleton of twisted girders on the ground. The horrifying event was captured not only in photographs but in a live radio broadcast that seared the disaster into the public consciousness. Reporter Herb Morrison, who was there to record a routine landing, broke down in tears as he narrated the catastrophe, his voice cracking with the unforgettable cry, "Oh, the humanity." His visceral reaction, broadcast to a stunned nation, made the disaster feel immediate and personal, a shared trauma witnessed in real time. In the aftermath, as investigators searched for a cause, a more profound interpretation took hold. The Hindenburg was more than a passenger liner. It was a floating symbol of Nazi power and technological arrogance. Its tail fins were emblazoned with bold black swastikas, a statement of national pride for the regime. For many watching around the world, the image of those swastikas being consumed by fire was deeply symbolic. This was not seen as a simple accident involving flammable hydrogen gas. It was interpreted as a stark act of divine retribution. The fiery destruction of this Nazi icon was viewed as a celestial judgment against the regime's growing hubris and its brutal policies. It felt like a warning from the heavens, a prelude to the greater conflagration of war that would soon engulf the world. The fact that it happened so publicly, so dramatically, and with such finality made the event feel like a staged morality play. The most advanced machine in the skies, a testament to human ingenuity, was brought down in a flash of fire, a humbling lesson that no symbol of power is immune to a sudden, shocking fall. The jungle of Guyana felt a world away from the fiery demise of the Hindenburg, yet it became the stage for an even more intimate and chilling form of self-destruction. Jim Jones, the leader of the People's Temple, had built a socialist utopia he called Jonestown, a promised land meant to be a sanctuary from American racism and capitalism. But this paradise was a carefully constructed prison. Jones wielded a godlike control over his followers, employing sleep deprivation, constant ideological lectures, and brutal public humiliations to break down individual will. He positioned himself as the sole source of truth and salvation, a benevolent father who demanded absolute loyalty in return. The community was deliberately isolated, cut off from the outside world, and fed a steady diet of paranoia about impending attacks from the CIA and other shadowy enemies. This isolation was the key to his power, transforming a collective dream into a shared delusion. The event that shattered this fragile world was a congressional visit. California Representative Leo Ryan arrived in November 1978 with a team of journalists and concerned relatives to investigate claims of abuse. For a few of the members, his presence was a lifeline. A handful of families bravely approached his group, begging to leave. This act of defiance was the ultimate betrayal in Jones's eyes. As Ryan's party prepared to depart from a nearby airstrip with the defectors, they were ambushed by Jonestown gunmen. The congressman and 4 others were murdered, an act of violence that sealed the fate of everyone back in the settlement. Jones immediately called for a revolutionary suicide, framing it not as a death, but as a final, defiant protest against a corrupt world. He called it an act of socialist revolution. Audio recordings from that day capture the terrifying scene, a mixture of chaotic grief and eerie compliance. Nurses began mixing a vat of cyanide-laced flavor aid, a powdered drink, and coaxing parents to administer it to their infants and children first. The sound of crying babies slowly faded into silence. Most adults then drank the poison willingly, while those who hesitated were forcibly injected by Jones's armed guards. When the Guyanese military reached the site the next day, they discovered a nightmare. Over 900 men, women, and children lay dead in the sweltering heat, their bodies arranged in rows, a grotesque testament to the ultimate power of blind faith. In the aftermath, many struggled to comprehend how such a horror could occur. For outsiders looking in, the tragedy was interpreted as a form of ultimate retribution. The People's Temple had deviated so far from every accepted religious and social norm, creating a closed system where a man could play God, that its collapse felt inevitable. The community's extreme isolation and its leader's messianic complex were seen as a recipe for a divine, or perhaps a karmic, reckoning. The mass death was not a protest, but a punishment for the sin of following a false prophet into the darkness. Jonestown stands as a permanent warning about the dangers of absolute power and the fragility of the human spirit when it is severed from the wider world. It forces us to ask where the line falls between faith and fanaticism, and what happens when the promise of heaven on earth becomes a mandate for hell. A mountain can hold its fury for centuries, then unleash it in a single, terrible morning. On the island of Martinique, Mount Pelée had been rumbling for days, a series of small earthquakes and ash clouds that unsettled the residents of the vibrant port city of Saint-Pierre. Many of the city's nearly 30,000 inhabitants were uneasy, but the political and social pressure to stay was immense. A crucial election was scheduled for May 10th, and officials, fearing a mass exodus would disrupt the vote, publicly assured everyone the volcano posed no serious threat. Newspapers even ran editorials mocking those who suggested evacuating, branding them as alarmists. This official campaign of reassurance became a death sentence for an entire city. Then, on the morning of May 8, 1902, the mountain finally exploded. It was not a river of lava, but something far more deadly and swift, a pyroclastic flow. This superheated cloud of gas, ash, and rock, heated to over 1,000 degrees Celsius, raced down the mountainside at hundreds of miles per hour. It struck St. Pierre with the force of a bomb, instantly incinerating everything and everyone in its path. The entire city was reduced to smoldering ruins in under 2 minutes. The only survivors were those in exceptionally protected locations. The most famous was a prisoner named Louis-Auguste Cyparis, a laborer who had been arrested after a drunken brawl and was being held in a solitary, underground cell with stone walls 3 feet thick. The cell had only a small, grilled opening for air, and it faced away from the volcano. When the pyroclastic flow hit, the searing heat and poison gas swept through the streets, but his subterranean stone coffin shielded him. He was badly burned on his hands and arms, but survived for 3 days in the dark before rescuers heard his cries. Another survivor was a young girl named Havivra d'Ifrail, who had the presence of mind to run toward the water when she saw the cloud descending. She jumped into a boat and rowed into a small cave along the coast, shielding herself from the worst of the blast, though she was severely burned. A few others on the very outskirts of the city also lived. In the aftermath, as the world struggled to comprehend the near-total annihilation, the story of Louis Cyparis captured the public imagination. Here was a man, a criminal locked in a jail cell, who had been spared while the city's most respected citizens, its politicians, its priests, and its wealthy elites had all perished. For many, this was not a random twist of fate. It was a profound message about divine justice. The man society had punished was the one divine mercy had chosen to save. The very walls built to contain a criminal had become his salvation, while the city that had ignored the mountain's warnings was utterly destroyed. Cyparis himself saw it as a second chance, a pardon from a power higher than any earthly court. He would later join the Barnum and Bailey Circus, billed as the lone survivor of Mount Pelée, a living testament to a mystery that defied all earthly logic. His survival forces a haunting question. In a cataclysm that erased an entire society, why was a single prisoner locked in the darkest hole, the one granted the gift of life? Was it a random act of geology, or a story deliberately written to make us question our own ideas of guilt and innocence? 9 experienced hikers set out on a winter expedition through the Ural Mountains, a journey that should have been a testament to their skill and endurance. Instead, it became one of the most chilling, unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. In February 1959, the group of students led by Igor Dyatlov was expected to check in after their trek. When no word came, a search party was sent out. What they discovered at Dyatlov Pass defied all rational explanation. The team's tent was found cut open from the inside, as if they had fled in a sudden, desperate panic. Their belongings, including warm clothing and boots, were left behind. The hikers' bodies were located scattered in the snow some distance away, some barefoot and dressed only in their underwear in the sub-zero temperatures. The immediate cause of death for most was hypothermia, but the scene grew more perplexing. 3 of the hikers had sustained massive internal injuries, including crushed chests and fractured skulls, yet there was not a single external wound on their bodies, as if they had been subjected to an immense crushing force. One young woman was missing her tongue. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence of another human party, and no animal tracks in the fresh snow. The official Soviet investigation concluded lamely that the group had been killed by a compelling natural force, a phrase that explained nothing and only deepened the enigma. In the absence of facts, theories flourished. Some pointed to a military weapons test gone wrong or a sudden, catastrophic avalanche. Others whispered about the indigenous Mansi people and their legends of vengeful mountain spirits guarding the sacred slopes. From this perspective, the tragedy was not a mystery but a clear case of divine retribution. The hikers, for all their experience, had trespassed onto ground that was not meant for mortals, and the ancient guardians of the pass had delivered a terrifying punishment for their intrusion. The bizarre nature of the injuries, so specific and yet so unnatural, seemed to support a supernatural interpretation. How else could you explain such force without a mark? The Dyatlov Pass incident remains an open wound in the history of exploration, a stark reminder that there are still places on this earth where the line between natural disaster and something far older and more mysterious becomes impossibly blurred. What unseen force could compel 9 rational, prepared individuals to slice their way out of their only shelter and flee, half-dressed, into certain death on a frozen mountainside? Great Lakes can produce storms that rival any hurricane. On November 10, 1975, the massive freighter Edmund Fitzgerald, longer than 2 football fields, was carrying a full load of iron ore across Lake Superior. It was caught in one of the worst storms in the lake's recorded history, with waves reportedly reaching 35 feet and winds howling at near hurricane force. The ship was in contact with another vessel, the Arthur M. Anderson, with Captain Ernest McSorley of the Fitzgerald reporting some minor damage and listing slightly. His last known transmission was a simple, reassuring message: "We are holding our own." Just after 7:15 that evening, the Fitzgerald vanished from the Anderson's radar. It sank so suddenly it never sent a distress call, taking all 29 crew members down with it into the icy, fathomless depths. The official inquiry pointed to a combination of factors, likely faulty hatch covers that allowed water to flood the cargo hold, but the sheer speed and totality of the disaster left room for darker interpretations. The Chippewa people have long spoken of an enduring spirit guarding the lake, and some whispered that the Fitzgerald had awakened a sleeping guardian. The legend grew that the ship and its crew had been the target of a native curse, a punishment for the hubris of sailing a vessel so large and heavy so late in the treacherous shipping season. This was more than a shipwreck. It was a modern-day myth of man versus nature, immortalized in Gordon Lightfoot's haunting ballad, which asked, "Does anyone know where the love of God goes when the waves turn the minutes to hours?" The song cemented the tragedy in the public consciousness, framing it not just as a maritime accident, but as a profound mystery. Did the crew, confident in their mighty ship, underestimate the raw power of the lake, inviting a form of divine retribution for their confidence? Or was the lake itself a living, vengeful force, claiming the Fitzgerald and its men as a timeless sacrifice? The wreck lies at the bottom of the lake to this day, a tomb for 29 souls and a permanent monument to the unanswered questions that linger in the deep. The story of a single flood sent to wash away a sinful world is not unique to one tradition. It echoes across continents and cultures, from the ancient river valleys of Mesopotamia to the highlands of South America, forming a universal archetype of divine retribution. Nearly every major civilization has its own version of a great deluge, a cataclysm intended to cleanse the earth of a corrupt humanity and grant a fresh start. In ancient Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh tells of a man named Utnapishtim, who is warned by the god E that the Council of Gods has decided to destroy mankind with a flood. The reason given is that humanity has become too noisy and overpopulated, disturbing the divine peace. Utnapishtim is instructed to build a great boat to save his family and the seed of all living things. After the storm subsides and the boat comes to rest on a mountain, he releases a dove, a swallow, and a raven to find dry land. The parallels to the later biblical story of Noah are unmistakable, suggesting a shared, ancient memory of a profound reset. Far to the east, in Hindu scriptures, a similar story unfolds. The sage Manu is performing his ablutions when a small fish swims into his hands. The fish speaks, begging for protection from larger fish and promising to save Manu in return. Manu raises the fish until it is gigantic, at which point it reveals itself as an avatar of the god Vishnu. It warns Manu of an impending deluge that will drown the world, instructing him to build a massive ship and take aboard the 7 great sages and the seeds of all plants. When the flood rises, the giant fish appears again, towing Manu's ship to safety atop a mountain, thus preserving life for the next cycle of creation. These stories, separated by thousands of miles and years, share a common core. A divine power, displeased with the moral state of humanity, chooses to wipe the slate clean. A single righteous individual or family is given a warning and the means to survive, becoming the progenitors of a new and hopefully better human race. This recurring narrative speaks to a deep-seated human understanding that civilizations can become so mired in wickedness that the only solution is a total purification by water. The flood is more than a punishment, it is a baptism for the entire planet, a violent and terrifying act of renewal that simultaneously judges the old world and promises a new one. Why would cultures with no possible contact with each other all tell the same fundamental story? Is it a collective memory of a real prehistoric catastrophe that reshaped the world, or is it a profound psychological truth about our own capacity for corruption and our enduring hope for a second chance? A fleet of 130 ships, the most powerful naval force ever assembled, set sail to conquer England. King Philip II of Spain, a devout Catholic, saw his mission as a holy crusade against the Protestant Queen, Elizabeth I. His Spanish armada was invincible on paper, a floating fortress of seasoned soldiers and sailors, blessed by the Pope himself. Their goal was to clear the English Channel, rendezvous with an army from the Netherlands, and ferry an invasion force to overthrow the English monarchy. The English navy, though outgunned, was faster and more agile. They did not attempt to defeat the massive Spanish galleons in a direct fight. Instead, they used a strategy of harassment, launching fire ships, empty vessels set ablaze, into the heart of the anchored Spanish fleet at Calais. The resulting panic forced the Spanish to cut their anchors and scatter into the open sea. The ensuing Battle of Gravelines was a fierce English victory, but it did not destroy the armada. The fleet remained largely intact as it began its long, desperate journey home, forced to sail north around Scotland and Ireland. Then the weather turned. A series of brutal, unseasonable storms, what the Spanish would call the Protestant wind, battered the great ships for weeks. Galleons were driven onto rocky coastlines, their hulls splintered by the fierce waves. Sailors who survived the wreckage were often killed upon reaching shore. Of the 130 ships that had left Spain, fewer than half made it home. The loss of life was catastrophic, a stunning blow to Spanish prestige and power. In England, the reaction was one of triumphant awe. Queen Elizabeth famously declared that God had blown and his enemies were scattered. The victory was not seen as a simple military success, but as a miraculous deliverance. The devastating storms were interpreted as the very hand of God, a divine intervention that had shattered the Catholic invaders as punishment for their hubris and their religious aggression. This belief cemented a powerful national myth, one that defined England as a chosen nation under divine protection. The destruction of the Spanish Armada was more than a battle won. It was a story of divine retribution that would fuel English confidence and identity for centuries to come, a reminder that even the mightiest fleet could be humbled by the winds of heaven. A community consumed by fear can turn on itself with terrifying speed. In the small Puritan village of Salem, Massachusetts, the winter of 1692 began with strange afflictions. Two young girls, 9-year-old Betty Paris and her 11-year-old cousin Abigail Williams, started having violent fits, contorting their bodies and screaming uncontrollably. A local doctor, finding no physical cause, declared the unthinkable: the hand of the devil was upon them. The girls, under pressure, named their tormentors 3 social outcasts: the enslaved woman Tituba, the homeless beggar Sarah Good, and the sickly Sarah Osborne. With these accusations, the machinery of judgment sprang into motion. The ensuing hysteria was a fire that fed on neighborly suspicion and religious fervor. The initial examinations in the Salem meeting house became a public spectacle. The afflicted girls would writhe and shriek, claiming to see the specters of the accused witches tormenting them in the courtroom. This spectral evidence, the invisible world made visible through the girls' testimony, became the primary proof of guilt. The jails began to fill with the accused, and the circle of suspicion widened alarmingly. It was no longer just the poor and marginalized. Upstanding church members, wealthy landowners, and even a 4-year-old child were imprisoned. The trials that summer were a travesty of justice, presided over by judges who allowed this spectral evidence and coerced confessions. By September, 19 people had been hanged on Gallows Hill, and one man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death with heavy stones for refusing to enter a plea. The collective sin was not witchcraft, but the community's abandonment of reason and mercy in a storm of panic. The terror finally began to ebb when the accusations reached the highest levels of society, including the governor's own wife. The trials were abruptly halted and the special court was dissolved. In the cold light of day, the horror of what they had done settled over Salem. A profound and lasting remorse took hold. Just 5 years after the hangings, the jury publicly confessed their guilt, writing that they were, quote, much dissatisfied with themselves and sensible of the insufficient evidence against the accused. One of the most prominent judges, Samuel Sewall, stood in his church and recanted, asking for the prayers of the congregation as he accepted blame for the tragedy. The accusers themselves did not escape unscathed. Many of the key witnesses, including Ann Putnam Jr., one of the most vocal accusers, later suffered lives marked by tragedy and ostracism. She publicly confessed her own guilt and role in the deaths, a broken figure haunted by her past. For generations that followed, this aftermath was seen as a form of delayed divine justice. The community had committed a grave sin by condemning its own innocent members, and the resulting decades of shame, legal restitution, and personal suffering were interpreted as a collective punishment. The retribution was not swift and fiery, but slow and corrosive, a permanent stain on the town's soul. The story of Salem endures as a chilling lesson in what happens when fear overrides justice, and how the quest for purity can become the greatest sin of all. 73 seconds into its flight, the Space Shuttle Challenger disintegrated against a clear blue sky. The nation watched live, including schoolchildren who had tuned in to see teacher Krista McAuliffe become the first ordinary citizen in space. One moment the shuttle was a soaring pillar of flame and ambition, and the next it was a cloud of smoke and falling debris. The loss of the 7 crew members was a national trauma, a brutal reminder that the conquest of space was never a foregone conclusion. In the search for answers, the official investigation pinpointed a chillingly simple cause: a faulty O-ring, a synthetic rubber seal in one of the solid rocket boosters, had failed in the freezing temperatures on the launch pad. This tiny, mundane component, compromised by cold, allowed hot gas to escape and trigger the catastrophic breakup. The disaster was a catastrophic engineering failure, a known risk that had been tragically ignored. Yet, for some observers, this explanation felt insufficient to contain the magnitude of the grief. A deeper, more ancient narrative began to surface. The poet and historian Michael Ventura articulated it clearly, writing that the ancient Greeks would have called this hubris. The idea was that by sending a schoolteacher into space, by making spaceflight seem routine and accessible, NASA had committed the sin of overconfidence. They had dared to trivialize a realm that belonged to the gods, treating the heavens as a tourist destination rather than a sacred frontier. This was a modern Icarus, flying too close to the sun on wings of technology and pride. The shuttle itself was named Challenger, a word that now seemed to carry a terrible irony. Were we challenging the very cosmos, and had it answered with a fiery rebuke? This interpretation framed the tragedy not as an accident, but as a form of divine retribution for human arrogance, a timeless lesson delivered with 20th century technology. The truth, of course, was far more human. The disaster was not a punishment from the gods, but a consequence of managerial hubris. Warnings from engineers about the O-ring vulnerabilities in cold weather had been overruled by NASA officials eager to maintain a demanding launch schedule. The real transgression was not venturing into the domain of the gods, but ignoring the quiet voices of caution on the ground. The Challenger disaster serves as a permanent, sobering lesson about the cost of prioritizing ambition over meticulous care. It asks us where the line falls between noble exploration and reckless overreach, and what we are willing to sacrifice in the name of progress. A king's ambition can be halted without a single sword being drawn. The Assyrian Empire under King Sennacherib was the most brutal military machine of its age, a force that had systematically crushed every kingdom in its path. Its capital, Nineveh, was a city of unimaginable wealth and terrifying power, and Sennacherib's annals boast of his ruthless campaigns. In the year 701 BC, he turned his attention to the small, rebellious kingdom of Judah and its capital, Jerusalem. The Assyrian army, a vast and professional force, surrounded the city, cutting off all supplies and escape. The situation for King Hezekiah and his people was utterly hopeless. They were outnumbered, outmatched, and facing certain annihilation or deportation. The biblical account in the second book of Kings describes a moment of profound despair, followed by a desperate prayer from Hezekiah for divine deliverance. Then something inexplicable happened. Overnight, the entire Assyrian camp fell silent. When the sun rose, the army that had threatened to wipe Jerusalem from the map was not preparing for an assault. It was a field of the dead. The text states that the angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 Assyrian soldiers. King Sennacherib, who had been boasting from his field headquarters, broke camp and returned in disgrace to Nineveh, where he was later assassinated by his own sons while worshipping his god. This was not a military victory, it was a supernatural deliverance interpreted as the most direct form of divine retribution. The historical record adds a fascinating layer to this story. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing centuries later, recorded a similar account from Egyptian priests. He tells of a massive Assyrian army that invaded Egypt but was stopped when a swarm of field mice invaded their camp and gnawed through the leather of their shields and bowstrings, leaving them defenseless. While the details differ, both the biblical and the external sources point to the same incredible conclusion. A seemingly invincible army was suddenly and completely incapacitated overnight. The most compelling modern theory suggests a rapid, catastrophic outbreak of bubonic plague, carried by fleas on rodents that would have infested the army's camp. Such a disease could have spread with terrifying speed in the crowded, unsanitary conditions, killing thousands in a matter of hours. Yet for the people of Jerusalem, the cause was irrelevant next to the outcome. Their city was saved, and the most powerful empire on earth had been humbled not by human strength, but by an unseen hand. The story of Sennacherib's army stands as a timeless archetype, a reminder that history can turn on a single, mysterious night, and that the arrogance of power is often its own undoing. How else could a single prayer topple an empire? He had crowned himself emperor, a man of boundless ambition who reshaped the map of Europe through sheer force of will. Napoleon Bonaparte's rise from Corsican artillery officer to master of a continent was a story of military genius and relentless drive. His Grande Armée seemed unstoppable, defeating the combined forces of empires and placing his brothers on thrones across the continent. Yet this very ambition would forge the instrument of his ruin. In the summer of 1812, he assembled an invasion force of over 600,000 men, the largest army Europe had ever seen, to march on Russia. It was a campaign born of hubris, a belief that no land could withstand his might. The Russian strategy, however, was one of devastating patience. They refused to give a decisive battle, instead drawing the French deeper and deeper into a vast, empty landscape, systematically burning their own towns and crops to deny the invaders any sustenance. Napoleon reached Moscow only to find a city abandoned and set ablaze around him. There was no surrender, no glorious victory to claim. With winter approaching, he had no choice but to order a retreat. The journey back was a descent into an icy hell. The Russian winter, famously brutal, arrived early and with unparalleled fury. Temperatures plummeted to -30 degrees Celsius. Horses died by the thousands, soldiers froze solid in their ragged uniforms, and the starving remnants of the army were harried endlessly by Cossack cavalry. Of the magnificent force that had crossed into Russia, fewer than 40,000 shattered men staggered back across the border. It was a catastrophe of historic proportions, a defeat delivered not by a general but by the elements themselves. For many watching across Europe, this was not a simple military reversal. It was divine retribution. Preachers and statesmen declared that Napoleon's ambition had finally overreached, that the countless lives lost in his endless wars had summoned a judgment as cold and vast as the Russian steppe. The snow and ice were seen as instruments of a higher power, cleansing Europe of a tyrant's influence. Yet Napoleon was not finished. He would raise new armies, but the aura of invincibility was broken. His final defeat at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815 was the culmination of this perceived cosmic correction. On that muddy Belgian field, a combination of his own uncharacteristic delays, the dogged resilience of the British under Wellington, and the timely arrival of the Prussian army sealed his fate. The narrative of divine justice only grew stronger. Here was a man who had dared to crown himself, who had shaken the very foundations of the old world order, now brought low by a coalition of the nations he had once dominated. His endless ambition, which had cost millions of lives, was finally met with a final, permanent exile to the remote island of St. Helena, a prisoner of the very world he sought to conquer. His downfall felt like a moral lesson written on a continental scale, a warning that no single man, no matter how brilliant, can forever defy the collective will of nations and what many saw as the judgment of Providence. A wave of thick, sweet syrup is not something you would normally fear, but on January 15, 1919, in Boston's North End, that is precisely what killed 21 people. The Purity Distilling Company had built a colossal tank to store molasses, a key ingredient in manufacturing industrial alcohol for munitions. This tank was enormous, standing 50 feet tall and holding 2.3 million gallons of molasses. It was so poorly constructed that it groaned and leaked constantly, with children in the immigrant neighborhood often scooping up the sweet seepage. Just after noon on an unseasonably warm day, the tank gave way with a sound like a thunderclap. A wave of molasses, estimated to be over 15 feet high and moving at 35 miles per hour, exploded into the streets. It was not a gentle flow, but a violent, suffocating tide of heavy liquid. The force was immense, sweeping a freight train off its tracks, lifting entire buildings from their foundations and crushing a firehouse, killing the men inside. Those caught in the open stood no chance, the viscous wave knocking them down and pinning them under its immense weight, drowning them on dry land. The clean-up was a nightmare, with rescue workers and sailors wading through chest-deep syrup that hardened in the colder evening air. For weeks, the harbor ran brown and the city smelled of rotting sweetness. In the aftermath, a public outcry demanded answers. How could a tank of molasses cause such destruction? The company blamed anarchists for a bomb, but the truth was a lethal mix of negligence and greed. The tank had been built with shoddy materials and never properly tested, all to save money and meet the high demand for wartime alcohol. For many in the deeply religious community, the disaster felt like a bizarre and grotesque act of God. This was not a fire or a flood, but a sticky, surreal punishment. It was seen as divine retribution against the company's industrial hubris, a judgment for placing profit so far above human life and safety. The very substance they used to make their fortune had literally turned against them, drowning their workers and sullying their name in the most humiliating way possible. The Great Molasses Flood became a landmark case, leading to some of the first modern regulations for corporate liability and engineering standards. It stands as a strange, darkly poetic lesson that no enterprise, no matter how sweet its product, is immune to the consequences of its own carelessness. A different kind of emptiness awaited settlers on the shores of the New World, a mystery written not in fire or flood, but in a single, haunting word. In 1587, a group of over 100 English men, women, and children established a colony on Roanoke Island, off the coast of what is now North Carolina. Their governor, John White, was forced to sail back to England for desperately needed supplies. His return was delayed for 3 long years by war with Spain. When he finally stepped back onto the island in 1590, the settlement was utterly deserted. There were no bodies, no signs of a struggle, and no graves. The only clue was a word carved into a wooden post, Croatoan, and the letters Ciaro carved into a tree. This was a prearranged signal meant to indicate they had moved to Croatoan Island, the home of a friendly Native American tribe. Yet no search was made, a storm was brewing, and Governor White was forced to abandon his quest. The colonists were never seen again by any European. The silence was absolute. For years, the dominant theory was one of tragedy, that the colonists, facing starvation and isolation, had integrated with the Croatoan people or been killed in a conflict. But as time passed, a more moralistic interpretation took root. The colony had been fraught with tension from the beginning. Earlier settlers had clashed violently with the local Secotan people, and the 1587 group arrived with their own prejudices and demands. In the eyes of later Puritan writers, the colony's fate was not a simple historical puzzle. It was a divine judgment. The colonists' potential sins were manifold: their failure to live peacefully with the native population, their own internal strife, or perhaps a collective moral weakness in the face of a harsh wilderness. Their complete and utter vanishing was seen as a punishment so total it erased them from the earth, a warning to future colonies about the consequences of failing to build a righteous community in a land they believed God had given them. The story of the lost colony became a foundational American ghost story, a tale where the wilderness itself seemed to enact a retribution for human folly. We are left to wonder if the answer was as simple as a relocation, or if the truth was something far more final, a lesson in how easily a community can be swallowed by the unknown, leaving behind only a name whispered on the wind. A quiet morning along the coastlines of the Indian Ocean offered no warning. On December 26, 2004, a colossal undersea earthquake, the second largest ever recorded, tore through the seafloor off the coast of Sumatra. The energy released was equivalent to thousands of atomic bombs, violently displacing trillions of tons of water and sending a series of massive waves racing across the ocean at the speed of a jet airliner. When these waves reached the shallow waters of the coast, they reared up into walls of water that slammed into communities across 14 countries. The destruction was instantaneous and absolute. Entire villages were scoured from the earth, concrete hotels were smashed into rubble, and families gathered for a holiday morning were swept away. The final death toll was staggering, estimated at over 230,000 people, making it one of the deadliest natural disasters in recorded history. In the face of such immense and indiscriminate suffering, humanity's oldest questions resurfaced with painful urgency. How could a benevolent higher power allow this to happen? For some religious interpreters, the answer was a familiar, if terrifying, one. They pointed to the hedonistic reputation of some of the worst-hit tourist areas, framing the tsunami as a modern-day flood, a divine judgment against secularism and moral decay. This perspective, while deeply hurtful to grieving families, echoed ancient narratives of collective punishment, yet for countless others, this explanation felt profoundly inadequate. The waves had killed people of all faiths and of no faith, the devout alongside the skeptic, the elderly, and the infant who had committed no sin. The sheer randomness of the devastation challenged the very idea of a punitive God, forcing a global conversation about the nature of evil and the role of pure chance in our universe. The theological crisis was profound, but it was matched by an outpouring of human compassion that also felt transcendent. The world responded with an unprecedented global aid effort, with nations and individuals donating billions of dollars and sending rescue teams to dig through the mud and wreckage. This response became, for many, the true evidence of the divine, not in the destructive wave, but in the countless hands that reached out to help in its aftermath. The Indian Ocean tsunami left behind a scar that is both physical and philosophical, a permanent reminder that our planet possesses raw, amoral power, and that our search for meaning in its wake may be the most fundamentally human response of all. The power to erase a pharaoh from history is a punishment reserved for the most profound transgressions. In the golden age of ancient Egypt, a young pharaoh named Amenhotep IV ascended the throne, and he would soon attempt the most radical religious revolution the kingdom had ever seen. He declared that the entire pantheon of Egyptian gods, from Ammon to Osiris, was false. In their place, he elevated a single, abstract deity, the Aten, represented by the sun disk whose rays ended in hands offering the gift of life. He changed his own name to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten, and abandoned the traditional capital of Thebes to build a new, gleaming city in the desert, which he called Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten. Here he and his famous wife, Nefertiti, ruled over a court dedicated solely to this one god. Art and culture were transformed, breaking from thousands of years of tradition to depict the royal family in strangely elongated, intimate forms, often shown bathing in the life-giving rays of the Aten. This was not just a new preference, it was a forced state religion. Akhenaten shut down the temples of the old gods, seized their vast wealth and lands, and stripped the powerful priesthood of Ammon of their authority. For over a decade, Egypt was a monotheistic state, its people compelled to worship a distant, singular god through the intercession of the pharaoh alone. Then Akhenaten died under mysterious circumstances. His successor, a boy king named Tutankhaten, was quickly guided by old regime advisors to restore the ancient ways. He changed his name to the now famous Tutankhamun, rejecting the Aten and affirming the god Ammon. The court fled the desert city of Akhetaten, which was left to the sands. What followed was a campaign of annihilation, not against a person, but against a memory. Akhenaten's name was systematically chiseled off every monument, his statues were smashed, and his city was dismantled. He was removed from the official king lists as if he had never ruled at all. To the Egyptians, a person's existence in the afterlife depended on their name being remembered on earth. This erasure was a spiritual death sentence, the ultimate punishment. For the priests and people who had seen their world turned upside down, this was not merely political revenge. It was divine retribution enacted by the very gods Akhenaten had tried to destroy. The old pantheon, through the hands of his successors, had judged him for his heresy and wiped his soul from eternity. His revolution collapsed utterly. His city became a ghost town, and his name was forgotten for over 3,000 years until archaeologists dug his strange story from the sand. His fate poses a haunting question. Can a leader's vision be so alien, so disruptive to the cosmic order, that the universe itself seems to conspire to undo it? From the silent erasure of a pharaoh to the roaring fire of a zeppelin, these 30 stories reveal a pattern etched deep into human history. We see empires collapsing, ships sinking, and cities vanishing, each event interpreted not as mere chance but as a moral lesson delivered on a grand scale. This recurring theme of divine retribution, found in every corner of the globe, tells us less about the cosmos and more about ourselves. We are pattern-seeking creatures, desperate to find order in the chaos of existence. When tragedy strikes with a force that feels inexplicable, we reach for a narrative of cosmic justice. It is a way to make the unbearable comprehensible, to believe that cruelty and arrogance do not go unpunished, and that the universe, in its own mysterious way, maintains a balance. These stories provide a framework for understanding suffering, transforming random disasters into meaningful warnings for future generations. They are the myths we tell to remind ourselves of the dangers of hubris, the importance of humility, and the fragile line between human ambition and the forces that can erase it. Now we turn the question to you. After this journey through history's most unbelievable tales of cosmic justice, which story has resonated most deeply with you? Was it the chilling mystery of the Mary Celeste, the broken cycle of Tecumseh's curse, or the preserved agony of Pompeii? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know which account of divine retribution you find most compelling. Why do we cling so fiercely to the idea of cosmic justice? The stories we have explored, from sunken ships to vanished colonies, reveal a deep psychological need to impose order on a chaotic world. Our minds are hardwired to detect patterns, to connect causes with effects. When a tragedy strikes that feels too immense, too random, or too unjust to bear, the narrative of divine retribution offers a powerful and comforting explanation. It reassures us that there is a reason for the suffering, that the universe is not indifferent, and that those who commit acts of wickedness or pride will ultimately face a reckoning. This belief transforms meaningless chaos into a moral lesson, providing a framework for understanding the unbearable. It is a way to cope with the terrifying notion that good people can suffer and the wicked can prosper entirely by chance. On a societal level, the concept of divine punishment serves as a powerful tool for enforcing social order. The fear of supernatural consequences can deter behavior that laws and human watchfulness might miss. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah, for instance, is not just a tale of destruction, but a foundational myth about the importance of hospitality and communal morality. The belief that an entire city could be wiped out for its collective sins reinforces the idea that societal health depends on individual virtue. This idea echoes in the Puritan interpretation of the lost colony or the preachers who stood in the ashes of Chicago, framing the fire as a purifying judgment. These stories become cautionary tales that bind a community together with shared values and a shared fear of divine displeasure. They answer the haunting question of why bad things happen to entire groups, suggesting that a culture's moral decay can invite collective ruin, just as it did for ancient Rome. Ultimately, the enduring power of these 30 stories lies not in their historical accuracy, but in the profound human truths they represent. They are the myths we tell to navigate the terrifying randomness of existence, to find meaning in our suffering, and to remind ourselves that our actions on both a personal and a collective scale might just echo in ways we cannot fully comprehend. They are a testament to our eternal hope that the scales of justice in some form are ultimately balanced.